Invitar a este escenario al especialista en análisis político y económico de conflictos, MSc International Political Economy de la London School of Economics e investigadora también en Carnegie Europe, Olivia Lazard. Es un placer, un privilegio también tenerla aquí entre nosotros para escuchar lo que es su visión con respecto a los distintos temas, las distintas aristas de lo que pasa a nivel nacional e internacional, que tienen tanto que ver con una industria tan competitiva y tan multifocal como es la industria minera. Olivia, de hecho, ha enfocado su investigación en la geopolítica del clima, la transición provocada por el cambio climático y los riesgos de conflicto y fragilidad asociados a este fenómeno y el colapso medioambiental. Le damos la bienvenida entonces a Olivia Lazard. Muchísimas gracias.
Ambassadors, señor presidente Cesco Leopoldo Reyes, mon ami, company delegates, thank you so much for welcoming me in Chile and for my first time at Cesco Week. It's a unique opportunity for me to engage with you about the energy transition and the future of planetary security. Chile is important in that conversation. That was very apparent last week when I visited Chuquicamata and SQM, lithium and copper productions. Like the many mines that I visited in the past, they represent the scale of the human enterprise within the planet. They illustrate that mining is the backbone of human civilizations and will remain so. They also demonstrate a characteristic that is profoundly and uniquely human: our ability to terraform nature on a grand scale. It is this ability that has propelled us out of the Holocene, a geological period of history that lasted for about 11,000 years. It was characterized by very stable climate and ecological conditions. During this geological period, the relationships between the atmosphere, our oceans, and our lands were so profoundly well calibrated that for the very first time in the history of the planet, humans settled down. We started sedentary agriculture. We started mining. We started the history of civilization. And we grew into complexity. So if we've left the Holocene, where have we landed? And most importantly, where are we headed? You've probably all heard of that term, right? The Anthropocene. I call it the geological age of uncharted territory for humans. In this age, the carrying capacity of the planet is now so reduced that the choices that we make all have trade-offs with tremendous security implications. The ways in which we define our courses of action, the ways in which we define progress, will determine whether humans can survive and with what quality of life. And we're not just talking about future generations that are not sitting in this room. Humans have already released more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere than at any point in the last 3 million years. As I speak, we are edging towards a 1.2 degrees Celsius increase compared to pre-industrial levels. And in the latest IPCC reports, we're told that we may reach a 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold as early as 2035 or 2040. But all of this will be okay, because mining superheroes are on the way. You, the people sitting in this room, are going to save us. Without your capacity to double copper production, to quadruple lithium production, and on the whole, to extract more critical minerals, there will be no safe future. I know that. You know that. And I hope that with this introduction, I'm getting you excited about being the ultimate green Iron Man. Because what comes next is a different part of the discourse. We need to talk about the problems in that storyline. Not because you're not the good guys, but because, like any good and interesting story, the good guys are also the ones that deal with the hardest of complexity. That's exactly what makes them heroes. With great responsibility comes great power. With great power comes, well, even more responsibilities. So unfortunately, tonight, I can't quite suggest a red or a blue pill on your menu. I only have one. It's a green one, and I hope that you can wash it down with good Chilean wine. I do hope that this is exactly what you're doing. I'm very thankful for the attention that you're bringing to me, but please do drink the wine. So here is the pill. The way that sustainability is framed within the mining sector today, and the way that sustainability responsibilities are shared between private and public sector actors is not going to work. Sustainability is currently still understood at the local level and operational responsibilities. It's fundamentally about controlling risks. The reality, though, is that mining may actually generate threats in the future for the planet if we don't get our direction of travel right and if we don't understand the stakes behind the energy transition right. This requires going beyond controlling risks only. That's because we're not just in a climate crisis. We're stuck in multiple ecological crises that stem from anthropogenic activities. All of them mutually reinforce each other and feed off of one another. And the fundamental driver behind all of these crises is a human rapport to material consumption which heavily relies on extraction, chemical processing, linear economic models, and global competition that use nature as a commodity and a passive landscape. And we're currently trying to double down on extraction in order to sustain civilizations that are approaching already breaking points of planetary boundaries. That has business implications for the mining industry and the value that the mining industry generates. Let me explain. The green dots on this map, this one, represent many of the deposits for critical minerals necessary for the energy transition. Outside of China, the US, Canada, Australia, as you can see, a lot of critical minerals are concentrated in Latin America, Africa, the Indo-Pacific, and Central Asian regions. Many of these countries are now the base camp of extraction. You all know this, even better than I do. But extracting in these countries can generate various risks. The first of them has to do with climate vulnerability. As you can see on this map, the red and orange countries represent high levels of climate vulnerability, and they neatly correspond with the countries that are well endowed in critical minerals. Climate risks are obviously context specifics, but we can see patterns. More floods, more drought, more fires, more storms, less ecological services. Beyond the disasters themselves that are having more and more direct impacts on GDP, indirect impacts include the undermining of certain sectors, such as agriculture, and in some cases, high-end manufacturing and processing plants. If a country that is climate vulnerable fails to invest into its adaptive capacity today, it is extremely likely that it will run into excessive debt and multi-dimensional insecurity problems very quickly into the future. That will result into chronic short-term planning and vulnerability to geopolitical scrambling. Why is this relevant to mining? Well, because mining extracts a toll on the environment. It has gotten better over the years, there is no question about this. But the environment, and crucially, the ecological services that ecosystems provide, suffers from water pumping, soil moving, pollution, and spatial industrial expansion. And the reality is that often we don't know how much of a toll mining extracts. In many mining operations, baselines regarding complex hydrological systems, biodiversity, and crucially, teleconnections between ecosystems do not exist. If baselines do not exist, and if it's not required by the government, then it's considered as an invisible externality, not as a responsibility of care. And in the meantime, concerned citizens or communities suffer second or third-hand consequences of ecological exhaustion. This elevates into grievances. And when grievances are unaddressed for lack of attribution, trust levels plummet and the social license to operate fails. But here's another part of the story as well. The impacts go beyond just the local level. Since we're currently talking about an exponential demand to feed an energy transition, we have to open greenfield projects, not just rely on the extension of brownfield ones. The issue is that in some cases, mining will take place or could take place in global regeneration priority areas, which you see in red and in orange on this map. Global priority regeneration areas are those areas that we actively need to protect, to regenerate in order to stabilize the global climate regime, and quite crucially, the global hydrological cycle, meaning the way in which water moves through the atmosphere and distributes rainfall all across the globe. In some other cases, mining could also take place in key biodiversity areas or in areas close to them, as S&P has recently highlighted in a study. Impacts of mining in each and every unique ecosystem are problematic. Another layer of the problem happens when we take the cumulative and aggregate impacts of mining all around the world, in places of significance for carbon sequestration, hydrological cycling, biodiversity conservation, which are all key to hold the planet into balance. So if we are to mine the grasslands of Kazakhstan, the plains of Serbia, the wet forests of Myanmar and the Central African region, the mountainous areas of the Andes and the deep seas, how are each of these ecosystems going to be affected in their complexity? How are the connections between these ecosystems going to be affected? And what will that mean for the biophysical fluxes that keep our balance, our planet into check and into balance? On this, nobody has a clue. I mean that. Nobody. There is no data. And if there is no data, it means it's not modeled. And if it's not modeled, it means that it is not taken into account by the IPCC. You may have noticed, for example, that none of the working groups focus on the ecological costs of the transition. That means that the IPCC scenarios are most likely underestimating the acceleration towards the 1.5 target, and needless to say, this is rather worrying news. It is even more worrying in the face of a fierce geopolitical competition playing out over critical minerals. This is where the profound risk to repeat a new scramble for resources lie. This scramble, as I have seen it, is already underway, and it is compounding the planetary risks that I've been talking about. Indeed, a lot of well-endowed countries in critical minerals also happen to be conflict-affected or fragile. That means that their governance processes are easily corruptible, particularly susceptible to disinformation, prone to polarization and divisive politics, non-transparency, unfair competition, violence, and over time, authoritarianism. You will be forgiven for thinking that I have just described most countries in the world. That's because competition is so fierce today that geopolitical actors are not just co-opting corruption and fragility, they are actively fermenting it. So you will understand my worry about the geopolitical rivalry at play. Because if corruption and fragility become part of a business model to secure deposits and processing capacity, then climate vulnerable countries will climb down from the development ladder, which will drive global inequalities to unsustainable levels. Not just that. Militarization will keep rising and therefore expand our demand for critical minerals to unsatiable levels. This is the type of scenario in which geopolitical competition drives ecological and climate breakdown beyond any point of return. And as you can all imagine, this is not a good business opportunity. Because in a systems rivalry that plays beyond planetary boundaries, no country remains stable. And no trade will actually stabilize over time. So where does that leave us? Probably with you wanting me to have stopped exactly at the part where I was praising mining countries and mining actors for being the climate saviors of the day. Oops. Or maybe you're waiting for me to tackle the part where I talk about solutions because nobody likes problems without solutions. Like any good complex problem, solutions are shared across different sectors. We need to move the needle on a trilemma: ecological integrity, inclusive and competitive economic distribution, and global security. To do that, solutions need to range from the industrial level to the geopolitical one, from the supply to the demand side, from the technological to the ecological dimension. And cooperation, unsurprisingly, is key between mining actors and governments, between researchers, academics, and industrial actors. The thing that matters most is the direction of travel. And that direction of travel today is actually making sure that we can make it on the other side of the energy transition alive and hopefully wiser for it. And let me be clear, none of the risks that I outline outweigh the need for the energy transition. The only way out is through. So let's look at action elements that need to stack up over time. It all starts within the mining sector and with national governments. It is first urgent to establish baselines for complex hydrological and biodiversity systems in your areas of operation and understand how your areas fit into ecological service provision and ecological interdependencies. Mining is a necessary impact to respond to the climate crisis. It is also a foundational element of Chile's economy. What is at stake is making sure that mining and other extractive industries do not dampen Chile's ability to adapt and secure its own future. In addition to building ecological baselines, mining actors need to integrate climate vulnerability assessments for your full set of operations, not just tailing management. Ideally, you need to understand how your impacts generate climate vulnerability at local levels and beyond. This will guide next steps into operational management and societal risk mitigation. Where mining actors find that this information is missing at government level for lack of capacity, I'd like to urge you to share information and support capacity building. Otherwise, most governments will allow permits that encroach fatally on carrying ecological capacity, which may compromise future economic viability. And this is also necessary to prevent a geopolitical race to the bottom that impacts everyone, including private sector actors. As a next step to the ecological assessments, It is time to move into the era of offsetting and regeneration. It's not just a matter of good moral responsibility. It will be good for you and for your business. Regeneration is absolutely fundamental to rebuilding water retention landscapes, water tables, and increasing the chances of disaster buffering in incoming climate disruptions. This means investing into your own operability and protection. Offsetting is being pioneered by some companies in the sector, in countries like Madagascar, ensuring and helping state and civil society actors steward areas of conservation, biodiversity, protection, and ecological repair. It takes me to my next point. In a climate vulnerable country like Chile, mining companies use on average 4% of water on a national basis, while agriculture uses about 70%. But in the most climate vulnerable areas, including in the high north, mining actors use 70% of the water and therefore compound the risks of local vulnerability. In the south, which is relatively more hydrologically endowed and climate resilient, other extractive actors drive anthropogenic change, which also change hydrological cycling and diminish ecological resilience, as well as water distribution across the country, probably also in the high north. So at the national level, it may be interesting to bring together different extractive sectors and actors, academics, civil society, and government actors to look into cross-sectorial adaptation planning, transformation of certain sectors in the face of the climate emergency, and collective use of natural resources. This is something that the government can facilitate and spearhead, but extractive sectors have a precious and huge role to play in contrasting information about the impact of their activities on the environment, on each other, and on the collective capacity to adapt. In turn, this cross-sectorial engagement may actually provide keys to a process that spearheads adaptation planning in a way that is collectively endorsed. Why is this important? Quite simply, because adaptation is the name of the game. The IPCC tells us that the risks of maladaptation are high and that they will cost countries and regions their chances of development, equality, and security. And if that happens, investments will plummet, debts will rise, insecurity will become chronic and take on many forms, including vis-à-vis industrial actors. This leads me to my final point. Under President Borić's leadership, Chileans have embarked on a unique process at a unique historical time. Chile is the only country actively looking to reform its constitution in the age of the Anthropocene. In my eyes, as a security professional, and quite frankly, as a citizen of the world, this means that Chile is well ahead of the game. This new constitution will ideally provide the state and its citizen with a roadmap for how to handle shocks and systems change in biophysics, ecology, and geopolitics, which will impact social contracts. Engaging with the constitutional reform process requires going beyond party lines to realize that the security of the country depends on finding adaptive balance between economics and ecology and national and global shifts. And in this equation, you can expect a change with regards to economic thinking. So far, we aim to grow GDP to benefit fiscal resources so as to handle shock. GDP is the center of gravity. In the future, expect shocks to become the central component of economic systems and define the transformation of GDP and economic activities to lessen shock at the source. This will change economic ties between countries and rewrite the history of globalization. So ahead of that time, it is my understanding that everyone, especially in high-impact sectors, have an incentive to engage with the government and vice versa in a way that delivers a safe operating space for Chile. This goes beyond economics-only conversation. And since there are loads of multinational companies sitting in the room, what you learn from an experience in a country can be adapted to another, and therefore create ecological economics of scale. With this constitutional reform, Chile may show the rest of the world what is possible in the age of the Anthropocene. Every person in this room gets to co-write the story of possibility in Chile, and in many countries that will likely follow suit. So I will leave you with these questions. What is possible? What is safe? And how do you make it happen? Thank you very much.